medical craft was to create ideas around discolored beads. So anyone know if I'm wearing this beads, I'm talking about the medicine that destroys communicable diseases. And that group of brothers and sisters who say, I'm the priest of HE.BOBI, they're studying secretly on this. We talk about this one. And we talk about at the crossroads. We talk about psychology. This is the African school of psychology. We use this bead and this color to secretly retain the mystery of the art and craft of how to deal with psychology. This is one of the most important ones. People love to say, oh, that's Ogun. Ogun is a war. Ogun is the god of iron. That's the mythical interpretation. Ogun is transformation of the human spirit. And iron is only used as a symbol of transformation as a process. Because you take a stone that's full of impurities and you put that stone in fire and you burn out the impurities and you come up with steel. Through transformation, you've created appropriate tools to be used to create civilization. So when we took these beads, it looks like beads and people worshiping beads. No, each of these represent an African school of thought in our philosophical system. And so culture is essential to get back to in terms of understanding what is African culture. And African culture is the culture of God itself. It is the culture of universal perfection itself. It is not a belief in nothing. The African culture is about the knowing we created the divinity. And divinity, and I'll end with this because it's important, because you can't separate culture from your divinity. You see? We created the divinity to explain ourselves to ourselves. That's simple. If something is, how do you say, supreme, omnipotent, and all of these big terms, then nothing else can exist but it. So if only it can exist, what the heck are we? It's aspects of that existence. Every cell in your body can reproduce you. Do you realize that? They call it cloning, right? I can take a cell from the arm, I can reproduce you, one from the butt, just in your perfection. Well, every cell in the body of the divinity can reproduce it. So each one of us contain all of the possibilities of the divinity itself. I know the nation said we were God, but else God. But African culture is so key to this concept of Pan-Africanism, because I have to come back to it, because I understand Bobby's frustration, but I may come down to Uganda and help you out. I was going back and watching Uganda lady, I'm there with Idiot Me. I was there when Museveni first came to power. I was there during the Bote. And we see the mistakes made, but we can't confuse the mistakes that's made in our efforts to try to deal with compromising and all of these things dealing with the West without taking into context the role of imperialism. And imperialism isn't a phrase. It's a group of bankers down on Wall Street, okay? Imperialism sits in Washington, D.C. Imperialism sits here in Boston. I lived here for many years before moving back to New York. Imperialism is about the control of the resources of the earth for the few. And they will do any form of genocide to do that. When you see what's happening on that continent, even in South Africa, and right here in America, Foundation of Black Americans, if you do not understand how the system manipulates thought through media, then you won't understand what's going on in South Africa. That's not xenophobia going on in South Africa. That's called British intelligence, Mossad intelligence, CIA intelligence, putting their operative in the field. But you can roll a snowball down the hill. You just have to start with one little tiny snowball. And then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you put some money in some people's hands and they can articulate concepts and ideas, before you know it, the ignorant in our community who is emotionally suppressed, economically suppressed, will jump onto anything to try to find salvation. And it's happening right here in America among us. People saying, we're not Africans. We are from America. We are indigenous. I go to a reservation every other year and celebrate part of my family lineage, but I don't say I'm Indian. And those on the reservation, I have to chastise them for not saying they're Africans. But you got to be clear on lineage. And lineage leads back to Africa. It doesn't matter who you are. Even if you're from Scandinavia, if you want to get it right. So when we talk about culture, culture is the educational system of a people that allows them to be instructed and informed by their ancestors' experiences on the earth to determine what to do next in order for me to survive. So that's enough, and then we could go on some more.
But before we talk about what role should education play, I think it's important to look at what role it has and is playing. Then we can decide what it should play. We cannot see where we're going unless we see where we're coming from. I'll start with the role education. I'll start with education. What role education has played in shaping African identity. I think education, or rather miseducation, has played quite a major role. In my view, negative. And you will understand I'm speaking as a 44-year-old born in 1982 and inheriting the effects of colonialism and neocolonialism, and born into an education system that is meant to channel me and the entire generation into a certain perception. See, we have an education, and largely in Africa, that is teaching us to be servants. An education that has taught us to believe that we are not enough. I don't know how it is in Ghana or in other countries, but until high school, we are told about the Canadian prairies, we're told about the traffic jam in New York City, Catholic schools, or Muslim schools, and all that. And we must understand, with all due respect to our religions, that religion was a major tool in the colonization of the African mind. And therefore, it is teaching us that we are not enough. It is to teach us that I must have a name Robert, and it must be my first name, and my African name must come next, and so on and on and on and on. That's why I believe that the major thing to do in our education system is to re-educate the next generation, to make sure while we learn, there's a huge effort to unlearn what has not worked and to relearn what has been taught wrongly and differently. That's my view. That should focus on our health, how to develop and purify our own health system and medicines. From where I stand, I have a grandmother that never went to school, but could look after a pregnant woman and deliver them, that knew the healing of most ailments and sicknesses. Unfortunately, that has been deliberately fought with our education, to the extent that the modern pharmaceuticals have actually pushed it down the minds and throats of our people that our traditional medicines are bad. Unfortunately, many of them, we've lost them, and it has not benefited us. But this begins and falls with leadership, because our leaders know. But the policies have always been influenced from the West. While we blame the West, I think we have to take the blame, because in our case in Uganda, we got independence 64 years ago. 64 years is enough for us to shape our own way, if at all we want to shape our own way. So the education, in my view, should be focusing on, when I was running for president, our education was focusing on 4 major channels. That is the academics, yes, the arts, the athletics, and agriculture. In my view, that education alone will be able to transform, because we don't only look at being doctors and engineers, but we need to understand that we as African people, our bodies are blessed with that ability. How about we understand and study the science of abilities so we can own the arts and the athletics way, like it has been in the history that has been rubbed away from us. That is my view about our education. That education, in order to shape our African identity, it has to be shaped in Africa, with African values and with an African agenda, not teaching, not maintaining the colonial education. 64 years later, in many other countries like Ghana, you got independence way before us. But you will notice that our education still has elements of colonial education. Now, coming to media, in the same way, because our media is largely controlled. The content seems many times to want to channel or to want to associate or assimilate with the West. That is what we, in many ways, define as fashionable and as cool. So that media also needs to be Afrocentric. I'm glad that Africans of today have social media, and we've been able to reshape the content with a little bit more African identity. I believe that is going to revolutionize our media other than centrally controlled media, which we have. The culture, I'm in agreement with Professor. I'm a student of culture. My first graduation was in music, dance, and drama. And just like Professor mentioned, these are just expressions of who we are, which is expressed in our music, in our folklore, in our dance, and in our storytelling. But ultimately, that culture has to be also Afrocentric. Develop the confidence to own who we are, to embrace who we are, to love who we are, especially our languages. It's unfortunate that our languages are not so far-reaching, because due to colonialism, we were largely divided, and you cannot very easily connect all of Africa with one language. Well, there's Swahili in the eastern part of Africa where I come from, but we find that our culture is transmitted in the English language, which is in many ways to the detriment. But owning back our culture and re-Africanizing it, I believe is what's going to help shape it to the African direction. I thank you.
So essentially, culture is how we do our thing, right? But, you know, the question of education and media and culture, it's all connected, because we have to ask, well, what is education? What is culture? You know, what is media? And so the real issue is that we are, you know, victims of cultural imperialism. You know, because the culture that we tend to manufacture is the culture of the people who dominate the world, and it's the idea. So in many ways, culture is ideological, because culture represents those ideas. And so are we working in the ideas, you know, of ourselves, our ancestors, right? You know, what Brother Smalls was demonstrating when he was showing you his Lekis. And he was saying that this comes out of a school of thought that was philosophical in nature. It was an education, the indigenous education of people, and the symbols and the icons that they use to educate themselves and pass on that knowledge. Many times when it was, you know, more indigenous and oral in terms of how we learn through apprentice models, right? So I'm not going to poo-poo, you know, the system, but it's who's in control of the system. whose ideas are being manufactured in that system, the same with culture. You know, part of our problem is because of culture, when you look at the images they portray, how they portrayed Africa, how they portray black people, you know, as being less than. But anybody that graduate from UMass, that they had to take an introduction to Africana studies. And we said, we quoted Anton Diop, he said that if Africans never left the continent, the world would never have been populated. Right? If Africans never left, the world would never. So then, how is it that people do not know that the parents of civilization is African people? So if you hate African people, you hate yourself. Right? And so when we look at the way that, you know, white supremacy and racism is being employed, right, it minimizes Africa, right, and African people. So that what we say about African civilization, in order for anybody to graduate, they have to be re-educated. Now, the problem is that we have to re-educate some of the professors who are in Africana studies and black studies as well. Right? You know, because when that brother showed that film here last night, and you had, you know, the priest doing something and the whole trouble, is that, yeah, you got to be careful with the images and the symbols that you project, right? Because then people get miseducated about what traditional African belief was about, what spirituality was about, what those kind of rituals were about. You know, they were about healing in many cases. They were about knowledge transference in other cases. They were about passing on the lessons of the past so that we could have the insight into the present and the future. Right? Well, we take it and we dismiss it, and we believe the knowledge and the education that somebody else has taught us based on their ability to control and dominate us. Right? And so with media, we are part of the media. When we leave here, people ask, so what'd you do? Where'd you go? Well, I went and we talked about Africa. We talked about this, we talked about that. Versus we talk about something that's completely irrelevant about our existence, right? So we have to learn, how do we spread the word? How we promote the word, right? How do we begin to control? This is what Marcus Garvey was about in terms of, you know, setting up a press, right? And talking about the centrality of Africa. Where's our press other than the nation, you know, of the final call, right? Where's our international press? How do we know what's going on internationally? When somebody tells us something, can we believe it? Especially with AI, especially with Donald Trump in office. He lies to us every day. Right? And the media let it slide, right? So we have to think about, how do we educate our children? We have to think about the culture, the way we do our thing. Now, that doesn't mean that the way we do our thing is positive, because people do their things in the negative. We have to look at a more positive, revolutionary aspect of how we understand culture versus the reactionary aspect of culture, the kind of culture imperialism that Asada Shakur had talked about.
Thank you. This question is very important and very near and dear to me. I'll say to answer the question, what role should education, media, and culture diplomacy play? A central one, right? A very important one. The Bible says, my people are destroyed from a lack of knowledge, right? And that is a reality that exists among us as a people. I can speak to this question to make us to think that we were less than who we really are, right? And so our condition right now is a direct result of us not having a proper knowledge of self. So now when we look at these roles, education, media, and culture, very important. But the question then becomes, what education, right? And so the problem is, and I think my brother Bobby, your name, Bobby, was alluding to earlier, if we have the colonizer's education, then it don't matter how much education we have. And this is the misnomer, a lot rooted in what the slave master developed and gave to us. So we have to control our own schools. We have to control not just the school, but the curriculum. We have plenty of scholars, right? Black scholars that we can develop our own history books and curriculum and teachers to teach people not what the colonizer or the slave master has given us. And we have a tendency to think that if we go even, folks look at these Ivy League colleges and they assume that you got a better education if you went to an Ivy League school, because these are schools that are celebrated by elite white people. So I want to go to Harvard, or I want to go to one of these elite schools. But that education wasn't really designed to liberate black minds. And it's not really, that education is rooted in white supremacy and the promotion of white supremacy. So if you have black people being educated in a white supremacist education, then we wonder why, after 58 years, we still in the same condition. So education has to play a very vital role, but the question is, what education? Where are you getting your education from? We have to go back to a historical root knowledge and not glorify these so-called universities because they're prestigious universities, but they're not going to teach you what you need to know from a brother like Randall Mayer. Now, if you go to these schools and you go to his classes and brothers like him, then you can get some of that knowledge. But again, I don't think they have you in Harvard or Yale, right? So education is very important. They don't even want them in UMass, right? So education is important. We got to control the education. Now, the other two, as far as media, is very important in culture because they play hand in hand. So now, when I think about media, one of the things that we deal with is we talk about social media. So now media has become a tool of education. There's a lot of people that get their information from social media, whether that's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, or other social media platforms, even YouTube, right? But the problem with that, most of those platforms are not controlled by us. Right. And so, there's a monetization. And unfortunately, what we see is a degenerate subculture that is being promoted, and that get likes and shares and views, all kind of to promote knowledge sharing, information sharing, right? And then we talk about the mainstream media as well. Now, culture, this is the part that's really near and dear to me. Because our experience as black people in America, we have a problem where our culture has been hijacked. I'm a product of the hip-hop generation, proud to say that. And in truth, hip-hop led me to the Nation of Islam. Because in the late 80s and 90s, hip-hop culture was conscious. So the rappers were talking about Africa. They were wearing red, black, and green. They were talking about Malcolm X, right? And it was from a rapper that I first heard the name Farrakhan. And I was a gangster in the street. I wasn't a church going. I grew up in this messed up situation. But it was through hip-hop that I was into, where I heard the name Farrakhan, and it drew my curiosity to listen to him. And when I listened to him, I had a spiritual awakening. And it led me on the trajectory and the path that I'm in now, right? One of my favorite rappers back then was KRS-One. His name is literally an acronym that means knowledge reigns supreme over nearly everyone. They were promoting the idea that knowledge reigns supreme. Now, why am I saying that? Because fast forward, though hip-hop culture started conscious and positive, it was hijacked intentionally. And so now, those that own the record companies, I'm not talking about the top rappers, right? Whatever rapper you think is the top artist or whatnot, they are on a record label that's owned by rich old white men that own the labels. At a certain point, they seen the power that culture had, because young black youth were becoming militant. They were becoming educated. Remember, we were wearing X hats, X medallions, right? They flipped it and they began to support a subculture, what I describe as a genocidal, self-destructive culture, which promotes drug dealing, drug selling, being a gangster, being a thug, and for the women, it promotes being a woman that sells sex, who's a stripper, and so forth. Right now, one of the summer anthem is a young lady who's promoting scamming and boosting, and people think this is cute. But they have weaponized the culture, right, to promote this degenerate behavior, really to criminalize us. And so culture is very important. I stand here as a witness and testimony on the effectiveness of when culture and the media is used appropriately, how it can be a tool of liberation and education. So in closing, all of these play a vital role. But again, we have to control the media. We have to control the education. If we don't own and control the sources of the media, the information, and the culture, then we're going to be subjected to the oppressor who owns these mediums and is going to continue to dangle a few dollars. You know, to a certain degree, I can't be mad at the rappers, because when you're coming up in poverty in the ghetto with nothing in the projects, right? You could, if you have good guidance, you can be guided and go to school, but most of us don't. So most of the leaders that we look up to is the drug dealers, the gangsters, right? That's real. If you're coming from a broken family, I can tell you my story. And so if that's the option that I had, I could be a gangster, I could be a drug dealer, right? Now look at the rappers. They could either sell drugs or they could rap about selling drugs, right? And if they can get more money rapping about selling drugs than actually selling drugs, to them, that's a better option, right? But the problem is the record labels that manipulate the poverty that our people are in, that would celebrate and promote these folks to promote crime. So, I mean, literally over the airwaves, over the radio, if you turn on the mainstream media, you're gonna hear a young woman who's glorifying scamming and boosting, which is crime. Or you're gonna hear rappers that are glorifying being drug dealers and thugs. In what society is it okay to publicly celebrate and promote criminal behavior? This is done in our community as a tool of re-enslavement, because when the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment was instituted, there was a clause that slavery had been abolished except if you have